of Jadaliyya and a non-resident fellow with the Center of Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. He joins me now from Montreal. Sir, thank you for your time. You just heard our U.S. correspondent there speak about Biden's increasing demands for a ceasefire, although it's quite a bit confusing to gauge the U.S.'s position on what's Israel been doing and saying. Is Biden, do you think, really interested in seeing a ceasefire happen?
I think it's quite clear that on the one hand, the U.S. has enormous influence over Israel. For those who are still in doubt, I think the past year has demonstrated how thoroughly dependent Israel is on the United States militarily, diplomatically, politically, and so on. And at the same time, the U.S. has taken a conscious decision not only not to use any of the leverage it has over Israel to modify Israeli behavior, but in fact to shield Israel from any consequences for its conduct, whether that's the genocidal campaign it has now been waging for over a year in the Gaza Strip, or indeed its most recent attacks and assassinations in Lebanon. So it defies credibility that the U.S. is somehow very frustrated and angry with Israel and opposed to what Israel is doing, while at the same time refusing to use the instruments that it has at hand to almost instantaneously change Israeli behavior. I think, though, we have seen a change. I think it's fair to say probably that in previous months, the U.S. perhaps didn't necessarily agree with Israel, but took a decision not to use any of its leverage and indeed to protect Israel from consequences. I think we may now have entered a phase where the U.S. is completely on board with Israel, shares its agenda, and is determined to see Israel's determination to change the strategic map of the Middle East succeed. I think the one thing that the U.S. opposes more than anything else in this current crisis is Israeli failure. That's the red line for the United States.
It's such a contradictory thing to consider. The current U.S. government is liberal. It believes in democratic values, believes in freedom, yet it supports a regime that inflicts such damage and devastation on foes that are much weaker than it. Obviously, the people who suffer most are innocent civilians who are just bystanders, who have really nothing to do with this and would just like to live in peace, really. So you're suggesting that U.S. politicians are not as impotent as they seem, although we do have to consider that this is an election year in the U.S., the backers of these parties quite often want to see a war that's won by Israel. How much is politics at play here in this seeming U.S. impotence?
Well, there is no U.S. impotence. There is a show of impotence, but that in reality, it's exactly the opposite, as I tried to explain previously. Regarding the electoral factor, yes, the U.S. is in a presidential election year. The election is only weeks away, and one would think that there is two things that the incumbent doesn't want. The first is an expanded war in the Middle East, because this would probably help Trump more than Harris. And the second is one would expect the current administration to take measures to try to regain the votes of those many tens of thousands of people who voted uncommitted or who have said that they cannot bring themselves to vote for the Democrats, even as they will also not vote for Trump. And so what we've seen is that the U.S., this administration, appears to be acting against its electoral best interests because it is so thoroughly committed to Israel succeeding in implementing its agenda. I know there is also a point of view which says that the administration cannot afford the backlash from pro-Israeli forces if it was seen to be exercising pressure on Israel. But it's almost inconceivable that more could be done for Israel by the United States than has already been done. And the real electoral challenge that's posed to this administration is not using any of its influence over Israel. And again, it has chosen not to for geostrategic reasons.
What are your thoughts on Israel's current activities in southern Lebanon? Do you get the impression, at least some people do, that Israel is trying to create a buffer zone much like it did in Gaza?
No, I don't, because the Israelis will be the first to tell you that if its purpose in Lebanon is to prevent Hezbollah from having the ability to launch missiles and rockets at northern Israel, this buffer zone is completely useless when measured against Hezbollah's capabilities. Israel has, for almost a year, been accused of not having a strategy, that its campaign in Gaza was primarily motivated by genocidal bloodlust and revenge and so on. But I think now we are finally beginning to see the emergence of a clear strategy, and that is that Israel believes that it has the capacity to dismantle what's known as the axis of resistance, the coalition of states and movements in the region that are committed to confronting Israeli and U.S. influence in the region. I think particularly after its successful assassination of the senior military leadership of Hezbollah and then the movement's general secretary, Hassan Nasrallah, Israel believes it is now in a position not to create a buffer zone, but to dismantle Hezbollah. It has been bombing Damascus several times also this evening. It's continuing its campaign against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And I think its ultimate objective is to create the conditions for a direct military confrontation between the United States and Iran. In other words, Israel believes it now has an opportunity, perhaps a unique opportunity, and the capacity to redraw the strategic map of the Middle East. And the key to all of this is Lebanon and its campaign against Hezbollah. But I would point out that Lebanon is also the location where historically U.S. and Israeli hubris goes to die. In Israel's case, it's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, which created the conditions for the emergence of Hezbollah, which it is now confronting. And in the case of the United States, you may remember in 2006, its Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice characterized Israel's war against Hezbollah as the birth pangs of a new Middle East, which turned out to be a rather premature abortion. And so I would expect that the current, what can only be described as a joint U.S.-Israeli campaign to fundamentally transform the Middle East through this invasion of Lebanon will probably ultimately meet a similar fate.
Before I let you go, Mr. Rabbani, I'd like to get your quote on something that was posted on Twitter, on X, just a moments ago. This is from Bassam Haddad. He's the executive director of the Arab Studies Institute. He posted, "Beirut is being pounded right now by Israeli missiles, jet fighters and drones. Like Gaza, it is totally defenseless against that technology. Missiles are hitting entire building blocks, razing them to the ground, killing yet more scores of civilians. This powerlessness is deeply indelible. It will be registered for eternity. When the fire and winds switch directions sooner or later, concretely and or politically, do not flinch, do not complain, do not forget. Israel's colonial existence is and has been the author of its own demise, as all racist structures eventually wither by their own doing and or by what they reap. We mourn our dead in the meantime, and we keep resisting the murderers and their accomplices at the point of execution." End quote. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think the tables will eventually turn on Israel?
Yes, well, I would have two responses to that perceptive comment by my colleague Bassam Haddad, which is that, first of all, the rule book was thoroughly shredded during the past year in the Gaza Strip. Um, Israel made clear that it would accept absolutely no controls on its actions, and its sponsors in the United States and Europe ensured that it could do so with total impunity. And it was every red line was crossed in the Gaza Strip, and it is against that background that we are now seeing this transferred to Lebanon with similar endorsement from the United States, which once again is framing all of Israel's actions within the paradigm of what it calls Israel's legitimate right to self-defense. I think the second response would be that what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere, has created a groundswell of popular opinion throughout the region that even if peace with this regime is possible, it is not desirable, and that the durable peace can only be achieved in the Middle East when this regime is dismantled in the same way that similar regimes in Europe and most recently in Southern Africa, the white minority regimes of Rhodesia, the former Rhodesia, and of South Africa were dismantled, because this is a state that is addicted to war, to violence, to apartheid, and therefore coexistence with it is an illusion.
Mr. Mouin Rabbani of Jadaliyya, appreciate getting your perspective, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've been glad to get Mouin Rabbani back with us. He's co-editor of Jadaliyya and a non-resident fellow with the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. Thank you, sir, for joining us. I do have a few more questions, so I really appreciate how gracious you've been. You said earlier, when we spoke about 5 minutes ago, that Israel is extremely, maybe 100% dependent on the U.S. Do you think that this is what Prime Minister Netanyahu believes? Do you think he believes he needs the U.S. to do what he's doing? Or do you think he experiences or shows signs of a sociopath?
Well, it doesn't really matter what Netanyahu, or for that matter, you or I believe about this situation, because there are incontestable facts and realities. You may believe the earth is flat. That doesn't make it any more round. The fact of the matter is that the Israeli military is entirely dependent on the tens of thousands of tons of high explosives and the tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons that it has received from the United States during the past year, and without which it couldn't have conducted either its genocidal campaign against the Gaza Strip or what it is now doing in terms of its invasion of Lebanon. And just to give you one example, on October 11th of last year, Israel prepared to conduct a massive strike against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and its jet fighters were already in the air. It took literally just one phone call from Biden to Netanyahu to say, don't do this, and the planes were recalled, and not a single bomb was dropped on Lebanon. So Netanyahu, I'm sure, believes that he can manipulate the American political system. And of course, he does have influence. He does have his groupies in Congress and apologists in the media and so on. That's all true. But as I like to say, tails don't wag dogs. Dogs wag their tails. And in this relationship, it's indisputably clear that the United States is the dog and Israel is the tail, or rather the proxy in the Middle East.
Syrian state media within the last hours has reported that 3 civilians were killed and 9 injured in an Israeli strike on Damascus. And the Syrian air defenses have been, have been intercepting hostile targets, they say, over Damascus, allegedly from Israel. Israel has been carrying out strikes against Iran-linked targets in Damascus over the years, which have ramped up since October 7th. How do you anticipate Israel's battle on so many fronts will end?
Well, as we were discussing earlier, I think Israel has now decided on a clear strategy, which is to dismantle its adversaries, the coalition known as the Axis of Resistance, piece by piece. I think that explains its ongoing invasion of Lebanon, whose purpose, I believe, extends well beyond buffer zone and is, in fact, an attempt to dismantle Hezbollah. At the same time, as you just noted, the U.S. Armed and supported Israeli military is now attacking Syria, and I think with the initial objective of seeking to expel Iranian forces from that country. And I think ultimately it's seeking to engineer a direct U.S.-Iranian military confrontation in the few months that Israel still has its devotee, Joe Biden, in the White House. I can't answer your question about how this will end because it's, I think, very difficult to draw any firm conclusions on that issue at this point. What I will note is that Israel has a very powerful air force. It has good intelligence. It is supported unconditionally by the West, by the United States, United Kingdom, and many European countries. But what we've seen in the past year in Gaza and elsewhere is that while it's a very effective killing machine, it's a rather mediocre fighting force, particularly when it comes to ground combat and especially in urban settings. And again, I would point out that Lebanon historically has been where Israeli and U.S. hubris goes to die. In Israel's case, in the 1982 invasion, what was known as Operation Big Pines, whose purpose was to basically remodel the entire Middle East. And in 2006, with the failed Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, Condoleezza Rice, hailed as the birth pangs of a new Middle East. And that didn't really go anywhere either. So I would not anticipate that Israel is going to be able to achieve either its or Washington's strategic objectives, but it can certainly inflict horrific levels of death, destruction, and suffering in the process.
What do you make of the response by Middle East countries about what's happening in Gaza, in Lebanon?
They've been absent. If you're talking at the official level, the Arab governments, I mean, their presence and non-presence has in effect been one of the same. They have been reduced to impotent, I would argue, even disinterested spectators. Their main concern is to not be directly affected by this crisis. Their main concern is to maintain their close relations with Washington, and this is something they don't want to endanger. And I think in the larger scheme of things, it's fair to say that they haven't lifted a single finger to seek to put an end to this, even though I think in the long term, that is a decision they will come to regret for a variety of reasons. But certainly compared to previous eras, the Arab state system, such as, or what remains of it, has not even gone through the motions, has not even gone through the formalities of seeking to formulate and advocate and promote a unified Arab agenda. And the concept of an Arab national security has been completely absent during the past year.
Mr. Rabbani, once more appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.